When we look at the human body, let's look at a lateral view first. And so things that are high up would be superior, and things that are lower down are inferior to things that are higher up. These structures that are higher up are also closer to the head. So that's the cranium, so they would be cranial. And down here, your tailbone's down here. So things that would be down here would be caudal, meaning tail. So this is used for structures that are on the trunk. So things like the eyes are superior to the mouth. The mouth is superior to the neck or the cervical region. The chest is superior, the thoracic region is superior to the abdominal region. The abdominal region is inferior to the chest, to the thoracic region. The thoracic region is inferior to the neck, the cervical region. The cervical region is inferior to the mouth is inferior to the eyes. You can also refer to as cranial and caudal, so the eyes are cranial to the thoracic region. You could say that as well. There's also directionality, so that's up and down. Directionality forward and back. You have anterior and posterior. So if you're moving in an anterior direction, you're moving forward. And if you're moving posteriorly, you're moving backwards. And you can talk about things that are on the surface. So the surface of the front would be referred to as ventral, and things that are on your backside would be dorsal. So you can think of a dorsal fin of a fish. Then the superior and inferior terms refer to the trunk. When we talk about the limbs, we don't use superior and inferior. We use the terms proximal and distal. So when we talk about the arms, structures on the arms are some are proximal, some are distal. Proximal meaning closer to the trunk. So the shoulder is proximal to the elbow. The elbow is proximal to the wrist. The wrist is proximal to the hand. The hand is distal to the wrist. The wrist is distal to the elbow. The elbow is distal to the shoulder. Same thing occurs on the leg. You have proximal and distal. So in this case, the foot is distal to the ankle. The ankle is distal to the knee. The knee is distal to the hip. The hip is proximal to the knee. The knee is proximal to the ankle. The ankle is proximal to the foot. There's also superficial and deep. Superficial, meaning things that are closer to the surface, closer to the skin or in the skin, and things that are deep underneath the skin. So in this case, the bones. This is the medial view of the foot. So you're looking at the arch of the foot right here, and this would be the left foot. So the bones are deep to the skin. The skin is superficial to the bones. There's a layer of fat underneath the skin, so the layer of fat is deep to the skin. The skin is superficial to that subcutaneous layer of fat. That layer of fat is superficial to the bones. The bones are deep to that subcutaneous fat layer. Some other terms that are used are medial and lateral. Lateral means more to the side, and medial means more towards the midline of the body. So say for instance, the belly button here, the umbilicus, is right on the midline, so it's more medial than the hip over here. Okay, the hip is more lateral, would be more lateral to the belly button, to your umbilicus. The sternum here in the middle, your breastbone right there in the middle of the chest, would be medial. Sorry, it would be medial to, say, the shoulder. Okay, and the shoulder is lateral to the breastbone, to the sternum. There's also another term, intermediate, and that's a structure that is between two other structures. So, for instance, the heart is intermediate to the lungs. So there's two lungs, one on either side of the heart. Let's see. The sternum is intermediate to the, you can say to the arms, okay, in anatomical position. Other terms that are used are ipsilateral and contralateral. And we'll also use some terms occasionally unilateral and bilateral. Unilateral means something that's only on one side. You fell and scraped your elbow on your right elbow, so that's a unilateral abrasion. Bilateral would be you fell down and you scraped both elbows. Okay. Ipsilateral and contralateral mean things that are on the same side. So ipsilateral, say your right hand and your right foot are ipsilateral. Contralateral means things that are on the opposite sides. So we have the right foot and left foot are contralateral. And that goes for, the right hand and left hand, right eye, left eye. Those are both contralateral. The eyes are also bilateral, and the hands are bilateral, and the feet are bilateral. So it can be a little confusing as to why you would use one term versus the other. Bilateral is really referring to something that's on both sides. Contralateral meaning something that is on one side of the body versus another thing that's on the other side of the body. So it doesn't have to refer to just both feet. Your right foot and left hand are contralateral. Your left eye and right hand are contralateral. So a bilateral refers to things that are paired, really, and contralateral doesn't really refer to, doesn't have to refer to anything that's paired. It can be unpaired things. Okay, next slide. When talking about planes and sections, or planes of sections, the first one is when you divide the body side to side. That's called a sagittal section. So you divide the body side to side. And if you go right down the midline of the body, that is called a mid-sagittal section. Or you may see it without the hyphen, mid-sagittal. And if you make a section off-center, doesn't matter how far off-center it is, that is a para-sagittal section. Also can be written without the hyphen sometimes. Lots of times in medicine, you're going to see these just referred to as sagittal sections, and if it's midline, you'll just understand it's mid-sagittal. If it's off midline, you'll be able to tell pretty easily in a lot of cases if it's parasagittal, but it's really best to be specific about whether it's mid-sagittal or parasagittal, especially when you're learning anatomy in AP1 like we are. Next slide. And on this slide, we see a frontal section. It's also called a coronal section because we have a crown. This is where your crown sits. There you go. There's your little crown. So the coronal section, or frontal section, and this divides front from back, or anterior from posterior, or ventral from dorsal. Okay, so a frontal section divides front from back, or coronal section. And lots of times this is an MRI here of the head, and lots of times you'll see on, well, you'll always see it, on an MRI or CT scan, you'll see abbreviation in the corner, and it'll be COR, letting you know that this is a coronal section. And just to point out some landmarks here, this is the brain. This is the skull. And here's an ear. Here's vertebrae, part of a vertebrae, and also here, and here, and here. And then we have here's the spinal cord. So just to give you, a little bit of orientation into the MRI. Okay, so there's your frontal or coronal section. Next slide. And in this diagram, they're showing a transverse section. Transverse section goes across the body and separates top from bottom. Okay, and this over here is an MRI, and it's showing the eyeballs. Let's change to a different color. Let's change over to red. How's that? So here's an eyeball, and here's an eyeball. So there's the eyes, and this is the brain here. So this is a section across the skull. That's a transverse section across the skull through the brain and the eyes as well. So transverse section divides the body top from bottom. Another section that is not described, well, go back to transverse section real quick. You can also do a transverse section not only through the trunk, but also through through an arm. And so that would be that's also a transverse section dividing the proximal end up here. That'd be proximal from distal, right? So, but anyway, and another section that's not described in the book, but it's any section that is not a transverse or sagittal or frontal section is called an oblique section. So, oblique section. So any section that goes across the body at an angle is referred to as oblique. Okay, and it can be that angle. It could be this kind of angle. It could be, so it could be much steeper, or it could be even just slightly off of transverse. And you're probably going to call this kind of a transverse section if it's that shallow an angle, but it still technically is an oblique section. All right, next slide. Body cavities. In the lateral view here, this is lateral view of the body. So this is the brain here. Okay, it's inside the skull. So that's where the cranium is, and so that's called the cranial. Should draw R's better. Cranial cavity. That's supposed to be a C. This is the spinal or vertebral cavity, sometimes called the vertebral canal. And then we have on this side, this is the anterior view. So we have the cranial cavity again here, cranial cavity. So it's the body cavities. Cranial cavity, spinal or vertebral cavity. And here we have the pleural cavity. And this would be the right one here. This would be the left pleural cavity. This whole upper part here all the way down to the diaphragm. So the diaphragm across here. And this upper part is called the thoracic cavity. And here we have this arrow here. This line here is called pointing to the pericardial cavity. And this whole region here, actually this whole, oops, I went a little wide there, sorry about that. It's really more of a box enclosing the heart and esophagus and trachea. That is called the mediastinum. And here we have so this region here, so this whole region here, sorry, let's do the whole thing. It's called the abdominopelvic cavity. So this is this upper part here is the abdominal cavity. So below the diaphragm, all the way down to the pelvic cavity. So the abdominopelvic cavity is divided into two cavities, the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. There's no real separation between the abdominal and pelvic cavities. It's somewhat imaginary line going across where the pelvic bones are. And we talked about that in the lecture or in the lab. And just to go into a little more detail on the pericardial membrane, the pleural membrane, and the peritoneum, those are all what are called serous membranes, which is a double layer membrane with some fluid between it. And the way you can see this, kind of visualize it, I say, is you take the heart and you kind of punch it into this balloon, and the balloon then surrounds the heart here. So on the outside, you have a layer of membrane on the outside, and that's called the parietal layer. And the inner layer that touches the organ is the visceral layer. So this pericardium or pericardial membrane surrounds the heart, and you have the parietal layer out here and the visceral layer next to the heart, and then you have fluid in the middle. And the reason you have this is because the heart's moving, and the fluid allows the two membranes to slide past each other, and it greatly reduces friction. You find these serous membranes that have these two membranes with fluid between them around all kinds of organs that move. So your lungs, they're moving back and forth, so you have a pleural membrane around them. You have your peritoneal membrane around your organs in your abdominal cavity, your intestines especially, because those intestines are always moving around and moving food through your digestive system. Next slide. And just to show you also the pleural membranes, you have the right pleural cavity over here, and here's the lung. That's the right lung there. And the pleura, the pleural membrane, is this here. Okay, so there's the parietal layer on the outside and the visceral layer inside, and then there's fluid between those two layers. And that fluid is in a space, and that is actually that space between those two membranes is actually what's called the cavity. The cavity is not actually around the lungs, what's around the lungs, but the cavity is actually within the pleural membranes, between those membranes. I know it's kind of a funky distinction, but that's the way it is. So then you have the visceral layer, so the visceral pleura, and you have the parietal pleura. Visceral pleura, viscera meaning organ. So visceral pleura is always on the side that's next to the organ. You have your diaphragm down here below, if you can see it there. And then this also outlines you have your pericardial membrane around the heart there, okay? And then you have this layer, let me change to a different color. Let's go to yellow, how's that? Then you have this here is your actual mediastinum. So it's not actually a box. I kind of think of it as a box, but it's really, it doesn't include the lungs. It includes the heart and the trachea and esophagus that are in the middle here, as well as the aorta coming out of the heart and all that. So there you are. There's pleural and pericardial serous membranes. The peritoneal membrane obviously is below or inferior to the diaphragm in the abdominal cavity. Next slide. Okay, quadrants. Here's quadrants. And these are divisions of the abdominopelvic cavity. And this is the 9 divisions, or I like to call it the tic-tac-toe grid. Tic-tac-toe grid. So it's pretty easy. In the quadrants, you have the, remember your right from left, so this is right side, because you're looking at the patient, so you're looking at their right, you're talking about their right and their left. So this is the right upper quadrant, this is the left upper quadrant, this is the right lower quadrant, and this is the left lower quadrant. Pretty simple. On the 9 divisions, a little slightly more complicated, but it's really not too bad. The hypochondriac region is this region here and here. Hypo meaning below, chondria meaning ribs, so underneath the ribs. This is the right side here. This is the left side over here. So this is the right hypochondriac region. You have the ribs overlying part of the liver here, and the left hypochondriac region overlying part of the stomach here. And then you have the epigastric region is in the middle. So you have left and right hypochondriac region and epigastric in the middle between those two. In the middle section, we have the right and left lumbar regions. And in the middle, you have your belly button, so that's the umbilical region. And then below that, we have the iliac regions, the right and left iliac region. And in the middle, we have the hypogastric. Hypo meaning below the gastric region. So in the 9 divisions, you have the right and left hypochondriac region, the epigastric region. Then below that, you have the right and left lumbar region. In the middle, you have the umbilical regions. And then below that, you have the right and left iliac regions. And in the middle, you have hypochondriac region. And there you go. There's the overview of the directional terms, planes and sections, body cavities, and quadrants, and 9 abdominopelvic regions.